Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us on today's panel discussion webinar, Executive Tips to Modernize Your Compliance Program, brought to you by the ITGRC Forum. The ITGRC Forum produces educational events for the governance, risk management, and compliance community, and we provide free market intelligence to all of our members. If you're not already a member, you can register at executiveitforums.org. I'm Kelly Vick, the host of today's program, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Today's moderator is Colin Whittaker. Welcome back to Colin. Colin is the founder and director of Informed Risk Decisions and has over 30 years experience in cybersecurity in government and in the private sector. Since retiring from the military in 2001, he took up the role of head of security at Apex. In 2010, he became the VP of Payment System Risk at Visa Europe, and in 2015, he went independent and currently provides cybersecurity risk consultancy services to a wide range of public and private companies. Colin is presented on information security at major events around the world and has published a number of papers on security. And on the panel, we have Kevin Jacobson, Chief Operating Officer at LogicGate, Chase Henson, GRC Consulting Manager at OneTrust, Jason Rolfe, Vice President of Solutions for OnSpring, and Todd Beeler, Senior Vice President of Product Strategy at Process Unity. We'll run through a more detailed introduction with our panel in a moment, but first I'll go over the housekeeping, learning objectives, and the agenda for today's session. First, the webcast is streaming live and all lines will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the conference. If you have any issue with the audio, please first check your device settings before contacting technical support. And we recommend that you paste our direct landing page into a fresh browser window and close any other live windows to avoid conflicts. The direct console URLs are displayed on your screen now, and they're clickable in the PDF slide deck, which you'll find under the Attachments tab with some additional supporting resources, so be sure to check those out before you leave. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so we've lined up some polls to get your input throughout the session. We'll notify you when the polls are open, so please listen for those and submit your response in the box below your console when prompted. Just make sure the console is not in full screen mode or you will not see the options. Also, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can submit these at any time using the question tab, and we'll be fielding those throughout. Today's program is approved by NASA and will be providing 1 CPE credit to qualified attendees. To qualify and receive your certificate, we require that you've completed all fields on registration, answer all of the polls, and rate us at the end. Please use the Rate This tab to submit your rating and comments, as we value feedback and take it into consideration when we're planning for future events. For those of you who qualify for CPE credit, certificates will be issued via email within 30 days. And finally, after the live presentation, this webcast will be available on demand, so please do share with any colleagues who you think will be interested in the topic. Our learning objectives today are to gain insights on how to use a risk-based approach to meet regulatory demands, employ digital transformation in the management of compliance obligations, understand the impacts of regulatory changes and minimize resource-intensive manual processes, and get buy-in from other departments and create a working group of stakeholders to develop and improve your compliance program. Moving on to the agenda. We'll begin with speaker introductions before running over some quick tips recommended by our panel, and then we'll dive into the Q&A discussion facilitated by Colin before closing with takeaways and further information at the end. So now, without further ado, I will turn the program over for today's discussion. So over to you, Colin.
Kelly, very many thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. To start with, I'm going to run around the table so we can hear a little bit from each of our panelists. I'm going to invite them to tell us a little bit about their organizations and a little about themselves, so that everyone listening today, either live or later in the archives, can understand our panelists' frame of reference for today's conversation. And Kevin, we'll start with yourself.
Hey everyone, Kevin Jacobson. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at LogicGate. LogicGate's a high-growth GRC software company based in Chicago with clients globally. We help clients with all sorts of GRC applications like enterprise risk management, IT security risk management, compliance, controls, third-party risk, and so forth. As part of my role there, I oversee all customer-serving areas of the business, and in addition, all of our business operations, which includes our own core risk management team, including information security, legal, and compliance. So I'm an active practitioner, as well as someone who uses our own software and the tips that I'm going to talk about later. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you very much indeed, Todd. Thank you very much, Kevin. Sorry, my apologies, getting ahead of myself there. Todd, over to you now. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing there at Process Unity?
Sure, Colin. My name is Todd Beeler, Senior Vice President of Strategy at Process Unity, so I oversee our product investment for our clients, as well as our alliance and partners and our enterprise customer development. Process Unity is a SaaS provider of GRC solutions. We're the leader in third-party risk management, but we help companies across the board from their governance, risk, and compliance initiatives. Mostly highly regulated industries is where we focus, but we certainly help all customers, small and large, in their endeavors. And I've got about 20 years of background within governance, risk, and compliance practice, as well as the automation side of it. So glad to be here today to talk about compliance topics.
Todd, thank you very much indeed. I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation today as we have had in previous calls. So thank you for joining us.
Great.
So over to yourself, Jason. Can you please share where you're coming from today with OnSpring?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Really great to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Rolfe. I'm the Vice President of Solutions with OnSpring. After starting my career in internal audit, risk management, compliance, spending about a dozen years or so doing that, I switched into the software world, and now my focus is on developing and improving the solutions that we offer on the OnSpring platform. We also present platform and solution use cases to clients and prospects, and provide general support to the rest of the OnSpring team in terms of platform and practitioner support. What OnSpring is we basically enable our users to solve their key business problems by providing a no-code platform that focuses on delivering best-in-class performance, gives them the flexibility to do things the way that they want to do them, and provides a high-quality user experience for their GRC processes and beyond. So, Colin, really happy to be here today.
Thank you very much indeed, Jason. Last, but definitely not least, someone has to be last, I'm afraid. Chase, please tell us about the work you're doing there at OneTrust.
Absolutely, and thanks for that, Colin, and really excited to be here this afternoon, and thanks to the folks at IT GRC Forum for putting together a great panel and content. But my name is Chase Hinton, and I manage OneTrust's customer-facing GRC team across the Americas. In my role, I work closely with OneTrust customers and prospects from small, medium-sized organizations all the way up to global multinational. And my team really assists our customers and those evaluating OneTrust GRC by understanding their desired outcomes around, proactive risk management and compliance requirements, really focusing on growing efficiencies and better insight into those blind spots. We partner world-class automation and deep regulatory research to help our customers grow their programs with a basic understanding of knowing their data and understanding their laws that apply to that data. And really focusing on a proactive risk-based approach. Myself, my background's in risk management and privacy governance. I hold both my CIPP-E and CIPM certifications, and looking forward to getting to the panel today. But a little bit more on OneTrust. OneTrust is a technology company that helps organizations be more trusted companies. We're the most widely used platform to operationalize privacy, security, and trust with over 6,000 customers globally, and we're just named actually the fastest growing company in America by the Inc. 500. Specifically, I focus on the GRC side of our organization and our information security and GRC offering, which is a fully integrated set of solutions to really help organizations operationalize the different risk management aspects, policy enforcement, audit and testing of effectiveness of your controls, et cetera, and even including business continuity and disaster recovery. So we really focus on customization, ease of use, and connecting to the outside systems to really give you that full picture of GRC and compliance. Excellent.
Well, thank you for that, Chase. It's going to be great to have you on the panel, and looking forward to your insights as we go forward in the discussion. Okay, I think that's set the stage very nicely, giving our panelists background. To kick things off, we've had our panelists identify some what we like to call quick tips for you, our audience. And these tips recommend to you things like nurturing the right compliance mindset across the organization, building a successful committee structure, balancing your top-down versus a bottom-up compliance approach, and scaling your GRC with the support of AI tools. I'm going to bring in our panel in to tell us a little bit more about each of those. Kevin, having the right mindset is important to ensure a successful compliance program. So what are your tips on how we can nurture this to solve compliance problems across your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is critically important. It's really about how we as practitioners think about compliance and then communicate to the rest of the organization. So I've got the three circles here that I think kind of articulate a way to think about it. One is just excellence in the basics. So, whatever the nature of the program that you're building, obviously you have to make sure that your program is set up for success to deliver the right results. So getting the basics right. The second thing I would say is recognizing the strategic importance of the business to the business of this program and then communicating accordingly. So what I mean by that is a lot of folks, when they think of compliance, think of things about checking the box or how can we apply as little budget as possible to check the box and therefore be efficient. But they don't often talk about how these compliance programs can be of strategic importance to the business. And in some cases, they can even be either directly related to revenue generation or one derivative away from revenue generation. So I think as practitioners, it's really important to connect the dots to these things for business stakeholders across the business, which hopefully ultimately gets their buy-in. So as an example, if you think about third-party risk management or controls management, in many cases, companies' customers have viewpoints about what those programs should look like. And so if we don't get them right as practitioners, we will be impacting negatively either future prospective customers or current customers. And so, you know, as you're asking for resources, as you're trying to build these programs, just really recognizing those things and connecting the dots for folks across the company is really important. And then the last thing I would say is this concept of relentless agility. So inevitably, there's more work that we can do to serve the business, and I think keeping an eye out for that is really powerful. An example would be one of our customers at LogicGate does third-party risk management in LogicGate, as well as several other applications like vendor management and controls management. And what they heard from their business stakeholders was, hey, you know, one thing that we really struggle with is articulating the business case associated with bringing on some of these vendors. Is that something that we could do include as part of our workflow here within LogicGate? And so the LogicGate sponsor and customer figured out a way to get that into LogicGate, which is something you can do based on the flexibility and easy use of our software. And that was just that person keeping an eye out for additional business value that they can bring to the table as part of the program and solve a business need. And so just thinking agilely like that and how you can increment over time in these programs, I think is really important. So all of this goes back to just the mindset that you bring as the leader.
Thanks very much, Lee, Kevin. I always think it's so important to remember to think out of the box when it comes to these things, indeed. And I think it brings very nicely onto Todd's recommendation, which is to build a successful committee structure. So, Todd, can you explain more about why this is important? Because everyone hates committees, and share your tips on building a committee structure the right way and making it work.
Yeah, and there's no quick. This isn't a quick tip either, Colin. It's you know, building a successful committee structure is something that does take time. I think to Kevin's point, you know, having the right mindset and tone at the top is really important. But, you know, to have a successful committee, especially around compliance, you need to have the right participants, but you need to have the right organization. When you invite all of those people into a room to talk about something as exciting as compliance, you need to have organization and a layout and a charter. That's really important, right? You need to be able to have that charter fit your organizational culture, and it has to have top-down buy-in from management so that all of the different stakeholders that will participate in that committee know that they're being supported and recognized by that executive team, right? One of the things that's really important for keeping success on that committee structure is to ensure that the business units are represented. You don't want to have a committee that's just full of legal and internal audit, compliance and ethics folks. You need to have business representation to hear what their concerns are and what their challenges are as compliance requirements bear down on their business. And you have to accept that and realize that that's an important part and plays an important part of the conversation as you go through, you know, investigations. And the final part, obviously, you know, systems and data are important. You don't want to leave them out of your committee structure. You want to bring them in. Technology has advanced. You know, compliance should be taking advantage of that and considering as part of their committee meetings and cadence during the year, how can we advance and keep ourselves up to date and refreshed with where the business is today and where the laws and regulations are today. And there's technologies that can be applied directly into that conversation. So whether it's inviting the CISO, of course, I think should be part of those conversations, but also IT to listen to how data-driven decisioning can help them. It's something that you should be putting together as part of your committee structure.
Todd, thank you very much indeed for that. I wasn't trying to belittle the importance of committees. I really a great servant of many committees in my past, and I know how important they are, so I'm not belittling it at all. Jason, Todd touched on the importance of the top-down approach, particularly in the sense of structuring the ownership of committees. But let's develop a little further with your tip, which is really to balance both the top-down versus a bottom-up compliance approach. So what are your quick tips and recommendations on how to go about this?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And I think what Kevin and Todd have both said, I think, lend very well to this whole kind of concept and conversation. Really like those points. But yeah, as it relates to this concept of top-down versus bottom-up evaluations, right? So leveraging both sides, I think, is quite important because of course we know that the regulations, the best practices, the policies, the things that are in place sort of at the top are really what's going to drive an organization's activities and priorities. It's inherent. It's just simply we have to comply with laws. We have to comply with regulations. We certainly strive to comply with internal policies. But it's just as important to kind of listen to what's happening in the organization, listen to what your people are saying, listen to what your data are telling you about what is actually happening. What are those things that are sort of bubbling up from the bottom and occurring in the wild, as we've all probably said once or twice before. And there's always, a lot of different ways, a number of different ways to gather and mine and analyze this information. I think that, again, lends well to Todd's point about leveraging technology. But the key point, I think, is interconnectivity, right? Let the top drive the activity and the action and drive what the organization is going to strive for, while at the same time letting the empirical data at the bottom in the organization really prioritize and bring certain things into focus. I kind of equate this to the concept of verbal versus nonverbal communication, right? One is a little bit more overt, the verbal communication, but I think we can all agree that the nonverbal is just as important. There's kind of two sides to that coin, just as there would be, two sides to this top-down versus bottom-up approach.
Well, thank you for that, Jason. I know we're going to come back to that in the panel discussions, but that's an excellent insight into why both approaches are valid. So thank you for that. That's great. Last but not least, Chase again. What's your quick tip for today's listeners, sir?
Absolutely. Yeah, and taking a slightly different approach here, since we are talking about modernizing, one of the biggest trends that I've seen in working with my own customers is, really engaging the first line, through your GRC program. And, it's a really simple concept. Technology obviously is very much the focus here, but still most people are still leveraging Excel in the GRC space today. It's somewhat repeatable, but really what you lose here is the ability to automate follow-up activity as well. Many of those requirements are directly tied to the compliance requirements that you have within your organization. However, we know that resources are extremely tight right now for most organizations around the world, and we need to do more with less these days. So automating workflows through intelligent risk automation is really critical because we know the number of threats and compliance obligations or requirements is ever increasing. So the job's not getting easier, right? So many of my customers are leveraging, what we call AI and robotic process automation, which AI is a big, a trending, phrase in the industry right now as well. But they're really leveraging it to automate their compliance workflows, reassessment based on specific criteria, the collection of evidence, and many other use cases as well. The most effective way that I see organizations doing this today is by scaling GRC out of the second line through robotic process automation-based integration workflows that really allow you to meet the first line where they're doing business today, which is really, really important, and it's a trend that we're seeing growing extremely fast in the industry as well. A few examples of this could be connecting to a development software or ticketing tools like Jira, to better understand risks early on in your agile development process. Updates on new projects in Jira could kick off a security or privacy by design assessment, just as an example. Integrating with your vulnerability tools to identify risks, give you that single pane of glass and, automatically triggering risks, but maybe setting thresholds to identify risks or vulnerabilities as risks that only come above that certain threshold. Maybe one last example could be integrating a vendor security rating service into your third-party risk management tool to help avoid blind spots between your due diligence assessments. And really, there's a few different types of AI and robotic process automation that we see. Machine learning is definitely one that has been talked about a lot. It does require kind of those large data sets, so it may be more difficult for some organizations to obtain. But robotic process automation, which I've mentioned here, really, building business technology to do the right processes at the right time based on contextual information coming in. And then there's a whole nother level, which more organizations are trying to get to, around predictive analytics, which really takes machine learning to the next level by stepping into a territory of not just summarizing and reporting upon data collected, but expanding these findings to really incorporate external data sets, regulatory research, et cetera. So a lot to unpack there, and I'm sure we'll get into that much deeper here during the course of the panel.
Well, thank you for that, Chase. That's set up us very nicely. All our panelists have set us up very nicely for the following discussion. We're going to pause here briefly on the slide with everybody's headshot, title, and affiliations, so that everyone listening today can put a face to the voices that they're listening to. And folks, everyone out there in the audience, I want to remind you this is very much an interactive conversation, and you're part of this conversation too. So we've got some great talent assembled, so please don't be shy and use the question tab liberally on your console and ask us questions. I'll be monitoring that for your input throughout the conversation, and I'll be feeding them through as appropriate. Now, in setting up the panel, one of the things we recognize is we want to try and help people modernize their compliance programs. But we recognize also that many of you are all coming from different places and different parts of the journey. So we try to structure the questions around a maturity growth curve, starting at the baseline for those people who may be just starting a program, all the way through to people who think they've got a good compliance program in place and want to grow the maturity of that even more with such thing as automation, the sort of thing that Chase is talking about. And we're going to put some questions across each of those areas. And I'm going to get things started. And we're going to start at the baseline. So I'm going to turn to you yourself again, Chase, and ask a very simple question. Well, we've touched on it already, but how do compliance professionals prepare themselves for this big journey in setting up these programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'm up first this time, so perfect. All right, yeah, great question. And, compliance is such a broad topic, and the requirements are extremely diverse based on criteria such as, location of operations, location of consumers, if personal data is involved, and obviously privacy regulations have added a completely new layer of requirements for compliance over the last few years. And what industry are you operating in, and what kinds of data are you securing and protecting? Fundamentally, you need to start with a smaller baseline and grow from there. It's really difficult if you try to bite off more than you can chew, so to speak. So that compliance baseline, again, it's really critical to understand that, but it's really difficult to scale a program, ingest new data, take in new applications or assets, business processes, and new emerging compliance requirements if you don't have that existing baseline. So it's always really important to understand the data that you have and the laws that apply to that data. Really in this digital world, this is becoming much more complex, unfortunately, for better or for worse. So really collaboration between the first line, as well as understanding the business objectives from leadership, which has been mentioned here, and looking for opportunities, not just negative risks, but also opportunities for the organization that's been mentioned here, is really important in developing that compliance baseline to work off of. I think a strong move for many organizations is having a regulatory research portal of some kind that can provide updates based on the compliance changes for the regulations and compliance initiatives that you're tracking, but also informing you of those new emerging regulations and jurisdictions that you oversee from a compliance perspective. So it's really critical to start with that baseline and grow from there.
Right, thanks for that, Chase. I can't agree more with the baseline aspects of it. I also feel that part of taking that baseline is actually deriving from that baseline of compliance obligations that the regulator sets you to define the so what questions of what it means, because sometimes regulations are, particularly in the GDPR terms, in respect of security and risk, a little open-ended at the best of times. So I think there's a lot more we need to do internally to drill down to what those actually mean to us in the sense of doing it, and that establish that from baseline. But I absolutely agree with where you're coming from. And you certainly
spot on, and that was a great example. Regarding data protection authorities, that's an amazing example. Yeah. They're really supposed to be working with organizations to help them understand the requirements as well. So sorry to cut you off there, but that was a great example.
Yeah, thanks for that, my friend. Yeah, and you did certainly mention the importance of, through baselining, understanding what data is available. And certainly the scope of where one might need to be compliant can sometimes be impossibly large when you're starting out, particularly for new enterprises setting up programs. So clearly you need to gather the data, as you said, baseline things, and certainly from that prioritize issues, because we can't, it takes to eat an elephant, you've got to take it a bite at a time, and prioritization is the key to that. So, Jason, if my organization doesn't currently have a methodology to do that prioritization or categorize elements of our regulatory compliance program, what are the key relationships or data points should we first consider?
Yeah, great question, Colin. And I think first and foremost, again, it kind of points back to what Todd was talking about with his, kind of the committee structure. But really it comes down to ownership. Before you're going to delve into any effort like this to be able to categorize and capture and relate all this information, it's really important to kind of understand who those key players are, who really has something at stake. And frankly speaking, if you really pull back the lens when you talk about some of the privacy regulations or other regulations like Chase was talking about, really everybody has a stake in it. So then it becomes a matter of understanding, okay, well, to what extent does someone have a stake? To what extent do they hold or have some sort of responsibility, which is certainly going to drive their level of involvement. But from there, I always feel like the best advice, and it's going to seem pretty generic, but we'll get into it, but is start simply. Right, focusing on the fundamentals. So fundamentally, for example, if I have a policy or a regulatory requirement, I first obviously need to understand what that driver is or what that requirement is. Well, then I probably want to understand, well, what am I doing to show that I'm actually meeting the requirements within that regulation or within that policy? So that could be, simply documenting some of the control procedures and again, assigning that ownership and making sure people understand what their role is in there. Or, for example, the very nature of doing business, creates risks that must be handled and managed. Well, I need to understand what's, important to my organization. And again, it's not just those risks, but, like Chase said, it's those opportunities as well. But being able to understand those and being able to place those in the context of what's important to the organization. So really just, having that initial understanding of who's involved, what are sort of those key elements that we need to align to, and what is that level of importance within the organization. And then from there, when actual activity level things are happening, those issues or those incidents arise, we're going to be able to start mapping those in or relating those into those established structures so we can start to see the impacts. We can start to see those pockets of uncertainty or those areas where maybe we need to dive in and get a little bit more focus. And so really, if you focus on the basics, the fundamentals, the what do I need to do, who's involved, it's kind of all those W questions, right? But that's never a bad idea to just start running through those questions when thinking about this concept of organizational compliance or regulatory compliance. And as you so eloquently said, Colin, starting to take smaller bites of that elephant so you can kind of, make it something more consumable and digestible. Starting simply is always a great way to go.
Thank you for that, Jason. Both yourself and Chase mentioned the importance of ownership and participation. And to determine who has skin in the game in the enterprise within terms of compliance. So I thought it'd be important to ask Kevin. So, what's your view, Kevin? Who within an organization should be involved in the compliance process, and how can they contribute?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think as Chase and Jason both said earlier, it's very contextual to what you're trying to accomplish and where you're at in the life cycle of your program. So maybe another way to think about it from my lens would be just as a start, how can you get the highest level general manager, if you will, whether it happens to be the CEO or a business unit head or whoever it may be, to understand the strategic importance of the program you're trying to build and ask for them to either establish it as an initiative or tie it to a core initiative and help you drive that kind of top level communication. And then from there, it's, I think it's situational in terms of where you're at, what you're prioritizing in your program, but really just spending time thinking ahead, who are you going to need things from? So, if you're running a controls management program of some kind, who are the control owners? Who are you going to need something from, and who are the folks on their teams? And then spending time thinking about what is really going to help motivate these folks, and really thinking about it from their perspective. So how can you tie the work that you're doing to one of their objectives? Does the idea of, you know, work that they're doing ultimately getting blocked by you know, necessarily blocked, excuse me, by a compliance issue at a later date? Does that motivate them to help kind of get started at an earlier phase? The idea of not making a mistake, you know, and really I think another interesting element to think about is when you're working with folks across an organization, how can you help bring those folks together in a new and a unique way where they're communicating and collaborating in a new way? There's a little bit of a people element here that I think can be important. And then other than that, I think Todd earlier had some good tips in terms of the way to think about a committee structure and things like that. But those are some additional thoughts.
Thanks very much, Lee, for that, Kevin. I think we'd all agree that one of the key internal personalities, well, if you listen to the media and certainly the chattering classes out there, at least by all the reports we've seen in the last week they believe that the key to compliance must be the CISO. And some big CISOs seem to have failed the compliance objectives in the first place. Well, with that in mind, we're going to have our first poll to determine what level of involvement the CISO has within our audience's enterprises with compliance. The vote's live, already below, and to input your responses, just please make sure that the slides are not in full screen mode or you won't see the options, which are listed under the console. Please remember, we require your input to provide your CPE credit. And while you're answering the question, I'm going to turn to Todd and ask for his insights into whether he thinks the rising role of the CISO and their importance in supporting the compliance landscape of cybersecurity, etc., and as well as many of the technologies that help with automated incident detection and prevention. How, Todd, do you see compliance groups interacting with the CISO in the future?
Yeah, no, it's interesting, right, Colin? It's an evolving role. It's a rising role, like you said. You know, many organizations are realizing the importance of what the oversight of a chief information security officer actually does, and it's not just sitting in a department, scanning a system. It's actually responsibilities for training. It's responsibilities for departmental development. It's responsibilities for all the different things that the CISO is responsible for in terms of managing the key assets, identifying where are the crown jewels in my organization and where are these risks, of the third party. So they've got a very broad oversight. And what effective CISOs are doing with technology is certainly they start collecting the data, right? They are already implementing much technology out there to go inspect and analyze systems to pull those in. They're looking at evidence as part of their broad overreach, which includes interacting with the business line applications and interacting with the technology groups. So they're already producing an answer bank, if you will, that I think the compliance departments really can leverage, right? When they're looking for something, you don't want to have a stale or stagnant data in GRC. That's the worst thing that you can have because it just, you're going to be chasing what the heck is going on a continuous basis. The CISO, for our customers that implement cybersecurity related programs, they're already putting in a cadence of annual collection of data to have accurate, available information, and compliance groups can leverage that. Number one, from an evidentiary perspective, to actually get data to prove compliance immediately from that, but also to look at how the CISO is acting as a best practice model for how to put that cadence in practice, leveraging technology and process and people together to make it effective. So, I think the future is the CISO will become, if they're not already, which it looks like the survey shows, which is good that there's a pretty decent distribution here, mostly are very involved with compliance conversations. And hey, on the flip side of that, the CISO also is very responsible for compliance in and of themselves, right? Whether some organizations look at them as a line 1 versus a line 2. And if you look at examples, First American out there with the NYDFS violations on cybersecurity was pretty steep. And, it was that they identified a problem, but nobody decided to actually fix it, right? And that's where they got caught by the regulators. So I think there's a lot going on with the role of the CISO, and they need to be deeply involved in terms of corporate compliance initiatives.
So therefore, you think these poll results are a reasonable reflection on what you're seeing amongst your clients then?
Yeah, I do. I think, it largely depends on the personality of the CISO, and certainly we see a lot of turnover with CISOs, right? They're in for a couple of years and they leave and go on, and so I think that role is evolving, it's rising, and it's settling into an established, seat at the table. And so I do think that this reflects that pretty well in terms of what we've seen from our customer base.
Thank you for that. While I've got you, before we move on to the next question, there's one that you might be able to answer from the audience, which I think is very relevant to your discussion about committee structures and everything. The question someone asked was that regulatory compliance versus internal organizational policy compliance. The question is, should this be handled differently? And if yes, how should we approach this?
Yeah, that's interesting. I do, regulatory compliance and going after those types of needs versus looking at how you manage your policies. Look, if you're going to be evaluated by an examiner is going to come in, they're going to start off by looking at a given area of regulation or a provision, and they're going to want to go in and ask you for your policies. And then they're going to read those policies and make sure that whatever's written in there is something that you're actioning against and you have proof of compliance with evidence. So I think it's definitely something that it goes hand in hand. Whether you separate those out into separate focus groups really is going to largely depend on the size of your organization and the complexity of the risks that you're up against, right? For us, highly regulated industries at the enterprise level, they certainly have the staff and the department and the committee structure to support separations of focus areas within the compliance groups in terms of regulatory or policy or security compliance, and they start to break privacy compliance. They break those down into the appropriate buckets. But at the smaller levels, you're just not going to have that scale to be able to do that. And either way, they do connect to themselves based off of ultimately the proof of what you're saying you're doing, and can you prove that you've done it, and are you actually doing it, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can't see how you can separate the two at all. So thank you for that input. I'm sure the audience will be grateful for those insights. So we talked about some baseline issues, everyone out there in the audience, all the things to start the program. So we're going to go up the maturity curve a bit now. So you've got a program in place. And once we have established a program, we certainly need to maintain it and use it. This requires competent GRC people to do so. I think, but we're all aware, not least because of the current COVID-19 issues, that a key management consideration is to reduce overheads, and cutting GRC teams, in my experience, is one of the ways of solving this problem, irrespective of how important compliance is. Therefore, I'll turn to Chase and say, ask a question. Chase, do you think there'll always be a human element with regards to making decisions around risk?
Absolutely, yeah. And I know my tip was focused on, artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence is great, and that's a big trend within the industry, and where I think organizations will see great efficiencies in their decision-making ability in the future. But absolutely, the human element will always be critical to making decisions. It's that context, that collaboration between business units, that direction from executive leadership to understand business opportunities. That can't be necessarily driven out of artificial intelligence or robotic process automation. It's really important to understand that to help configure the AI and robotic process automation, which I think is really important. And going back to Todd's tip around the committee, there is so much human context, since we're talking about the human element, that needs to be layered into the insights that you may gain from artificial intelligence or robotic process automation. Your executives are the one creating the strategy. So are your compliance objectives aligned with that strategy? I think that's, one of the big questions that all compliance professionals should have. And actually it's funny that we're talking about this. Risk management, I'm not sure if others have seen, but I'm trying to remember the survey now, but risk management is now firmly in the top 10 priorities for CEOs for the first time ever. So that's a really exciting trend, and hopefully executives are seeing that there are opportunities in proactive risk management and compliance as well. But you also have to include the context from the first line. They're involved with the day-to-day activities, the collection of evidence, control, implementation, et cetera. So there's a ton of context that comes from those teams that you could be missing. So again, going back to Todd's point, that committee should really be helping drive the strategy that you leverage from a technology automation standpoint if you're leveraging artificial intelligence, machine learning, or robotic process automation. But yes, absolutely, the human element will always be critical, in my opinion.
Chase, brilliant. I'm glad you said that. I was a little worried that a technological person on your side might be come on the other side of the fence, but I had no doubt that you would come down on the right side of the fence in the end, so thank you for that. I believe that we're all familiar with the 27001 Plan, Do, Check, Act model. This requires us to reassess and reevaluate activities, and nowhere is this more important than looking at a regulatory compliance program to check that it's up to date and we're doing the right thing. But as Jason was saying, the way of doing this is an open question, whether it's going top down or bottom up. So we thought it'd be instructive for us to evaluate how you, the audience, will evaluate your program. So we're going to run our next poll, and it's all about which methodologies your organizations leverage when doing the review. Again, the poll is now live and will be active for a minute or so please input your response below the console. And while you respond, I'm going to get a professional view from Jason. What are some of the indicators within an organization that can help leverage whether driving a bottom-up evaluation of a regulatory requirement is the right thing to do versus a top-down approach?
Yeah, sure, Colin. So first, I got to just make sure that I'm clear here, and I realize that sometimes we can get hung up in semantics, right? The concept of top-down versus bottom-up could potentially mean different things to different people. But just to kind of level set, I kind of talked about it before. The top, we're talking about regulations, we're talking about policies. To some extent, you might even be talking about things like social norms, just things that drive our behavior, things that push us to do something. Whereas obviously the bottom are those actual happenings, right? The things that are occurring in the daily course of life and the daily course of business. So I think they're just sort of, they're always going to be tied together. There's always going to be a link. It's really a matter of identifying and leveraging that link in a way that you can understand it and in a way that's meaningful to your organization. Certainly there will be conditions and situations where applying bottom-up makes a lot more sense, right? Obviously you may have a regulation that says you need to control access to your networks, for example, or a policy that talks about controlling access to networks. But the actual, the data, the actual vulnerabilities, the incidents, the brute force attacks, those sorts of things are going to do a wealth of good, and in terms of informing you where your problems might lie. So in our world, kind of like I said, we're commonly talking about things like findings, incidents, loss events, key risk indicators, key performance indicators, and the like, right? Those are those empirical data points that are coming up from the bottom. The key to being able to really establish and appropriately leverage that relationship is, number one, an efficient and complete capture of the right data, whether that is via, from a human or from a machine. But knowing what you need is really important and really impactful, and that goes back to Chase's point about the human element. I agree with Chase. I think there's always going to be a human element because there's always some level of judgment required, right? But from there, making sure we're assigning those clear responsibilities for analyzing, responding, and addressing those items that are coming up and placing them in the right context, and more importantly, having a method to establish and kind of maintain and monitor those key relationships. Way back to, and I apologize, I think it was Kevin's point at the beginning where he talked about this concept of structure versus agility. I couldn't agree more. It's like you need to establish the structure. You need to know how these top down or top elements relate to the bottom elements, but you also need to have that kind of level of judgment to make sure that you're constantly reevaluating. Is this the right relationship? Is this potentially impacting something else? So that when you do that aggregation and you're sharing that information between the levels, it is actually meaningful.
What's your views on what the audience have come back with?
Pretty interesting. I would say that I'm not surprised to see that sort of the plurality is the top down and bottom up. it is interesting, and maybe this could be an industry-specific thing. Obviously, if we stratified the results, we might see something a little more interesting there. But in something where the operations are very widespread and distributed, let's say to a large number of subsidiaries or a large number of individual locations, whether those are plants or retail shops or what have you, I can definitely see bottom up being a big driver, right? There's the primary function of the business is existing at a very granular or a very distributed level. Top down, I immediately start thinking about, financial services, right? We're going to use these hardcore regulations and requirements to drive us. I'm definitely not surprised, though, to see that the top-down and bottom-up approach is really, using those in concert with one another is really the majority there, or the plurality, like I said. I'm definitely curious to know what the neither or the other is. It could just be that, folks are getting started with their risk management programs and they're looking to this as a way to get started or a way to kind of prioritize those regulatory requirements, or perhaps it's just not a highly regulated industry. But no, these are interesting, but I think expected poll results.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Jason. Okay, so we've actually looked at a couple of things to do with operating a compliance program once we've got one up and running. One of the next things must be do to make sure it's running efficiently. This, to my mind, ensuring that there are no duplications, because that's wasted effort, and certainly making sure there's no gaps. And our third poll is designed to gauge how well you, in the audience, within your enterprises, think you are streamlining your own programs. And we're going to be asking the question, to what extent do you experience duplication of effort to address and meet compliance requirements of the organization? And that poll is now live, so please go ahead and respond. And while you're doing that, I think it'd be useful to get some insights into where our panelists think enterprises are less compliance efficient, if I can put it that way. So Kevin, what do companies often overlook in regards to their compliance processes, and what areas do companies spend too much time relative to the value to be derived, in your opinion?
Yeah, great question. And I think, one of the important contexts is, irrespective of the size of the organization, you're always operating with a relatively limited budget and a relatively limited resources relative to what you would likely need at that time or feel that you need. And so with that, we typically see two challenges. One way to look at it is too much time spent on the kind of lowest value manual processes, and oftentimes it's just necessarily so depending upon how sophisticated the program is, but that's spreadsheets, emails, meetings, and really no way to invest in scalability over time. So too much time spent on those activities. And then the inverse would be not enough time spent, therefore thinking for scale, building as scalable solutions, like automating as much as you can. So things like notifications, due dates, communication work, things like that. So building scalable solutions, not enough time spent on that, not enough time spent streamlining the work. Think things like evidence collection and then communication and collaboration about those things. Time streamlining the work by aligning the team. And so asking yourself, how can I bring folks together to make sure everyone understands how these efforts are moving, which can hopefully ultimately decrease the amount of duplication of work that happens, or and therefore make it more efficient. And so, too much time spent on those things and not enough time spent on the other things. Ultimately, what it's about is how can you create as much time and resources as possible that you can reinvest in the most strategic work. And so it was really encouraging to see on the last poll that most of the audience is thinking about elements of top-down and bottoms up in terms of prioritizing their work. And so when you're building scalable solutions, streamlining and trying to eliminate as much manual work as possible, you often find that you can free up time to reinvest in that strategic work, which is ultimately super important at this point in time, just given how fast things are changing. The concepts of risks inside companies, even if the company has been around for many years, can change very quickly. And so making sure that you have enough time to spend thinking about where you're spending your time, I think is often overlooked, and sometimes necessarily so, but I think challenging yourself to get on the other side of it as much as you can is important.
Thanks very much, Kevin. What's your opinion on the results? It seems interesting to me that we've clearly got some very honest people in our audience, with nearly 27% suggesting they've got a high duplication of effort. Have you got any advice and guidance to them?
Yeah, I think this is not surprising. I think, seeing the kind of the bell curve with no and high, and then a large portion of the group in the somewhat. So I think it's a little bit back to what I was saying earlier, which is just spending that time trying to get to the core issues, and it's a lot of what we've talked about earlier in terms of who is involved in the processes. How can we invest in scalable systems and programs and processes and ways to communicate, and potentially, think, irrespective of what you're doing now, start on a whiteboard, start over and think about, okay, as it stands today, who's involved, what do they need to know, what systems should we have in place, do we have the right system, do we not, should we be talking to vendors, what should we be thinking about, and then start to try to understand what the core issue is, and start to just chip away at it, right? I mean, that's really all you can do, but it starts with, I think, thinking for scale and freeing up your time to invest in this type of work.
Thanks very much indeed, Kevin. We're going to go on to our last real sort of tip in relationship to where we currently stand above the baseline and before we go into really mature organizations. And that's where some organizations have got certain expectations placed on the regulator and how they should apply with pre-existing compliance obligations. And one of those is known as the 3 lines of defense model, particularly used in the financial sector. So I'm going to turn to Todd. Todd's got a lot of experience in this area. So Todd, can you summarize for our audience what the 3 lines of defense model is and how it promotes a strong compliance culture? And particularly, you might want to offer a view on how organizations can look to deploy digital assets in considering how they meet the 3 lines of defense.
Yeah, sure, Colin. And I think it goes along with a lot of what we've been talking about today. So, the 3 lines, really, you're talking about a model of audit, right? So line 1 is the frontline business that's executing delivering products and services to customers and interacting, and they're executing processes that, of course, have inherent risk and control requirements inside of them. You have line 2 of defense really stipulates that these are the compliance or risk teams that are providing oversight and engagement with the line 1 business owners to promote good behavior, good process, and make sure that they are certifying, attesting, and performing those processes as they were defined. And then finally, line 3 really is your audit role, right? Your independent assurance group that is going to come in without relationship, if you will, and be able to make sure and attest and certify against objective testing and conclusions on effectiveness for the overall program that line 1 and line 2 are working together on. They just released a new version of this called the 3 lines model. They sort of got rid of the defense word, but it really is about promoting more business integration between those first 2 lines, right? And making not a separate line between the business and the compliance and risk teams in terms of how they operate and effective. And I think we've been talking about that today regarding how you want to get more embedded risk and compliance activities into the actual business processes while they're happening. And as you go towards looking at the age of digital assets, right, and the digitization of everything, the speed of business gets to pick up because everything's electronic, so everything can move faster, things can be implemented faster, data moves faster. But what that does as the speed of business picks up is, so does the speed of risk and the rate of non-compliance. So you've got to be able to have your compliance system keep up. And by doing that, what can you do with your compliance system? Like I said before, stale GRC data is a killer in the compliance world. And you need to have that a strong established compliance backbone of a control framework, a risk framework, that in a regulatory compliance understanding that are the single source of truth. But then you need to have a heartbeat out into the business, into the front line to pick up change, right? When something changes, when something needs to be executed from a risk or compliance standpoint or a business process change, I need to know that in the compliance database, right? Yeah. So you need to have that heartbeat, and that's really important. So we see, and we help organizations establish that home base for their risk and compliance model, and then really start to prioritize the automation initiatives to assist with keeping that heartbeat alive, right? And that's really important. And for us, I'll give you an example, third-party risk. embedding that into your procurement department so that when they're onboarding a new vendor, risk is part of their decision. Risk is part of how they decide which vendor to go to. And as part of doing that, you have your evidence created for you for proof of compliance on your third-party risk program as just part of them doing their business process. And, we help organizations do that embedded risk and compliance management because it makes it stays away from that stagnant GRC data that has been prevalent out there in the last, decade or plus. So.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Todd. I think that's a very useful insight. Yeah. I know we'll come to the issue of third parties and the issue of compliance later on. We're now going to move on to what I'd like to call how we kick it up a gear to help people really grow their compliance programs into best-of-breed compliance programs. One of the most important things is making sure, we recognize as much as our enterprises evolve, regulations evolve, and not just regulations, actually the fundamental guidance that a lot of regulators develop in support of their regulations changes over time as they respond to the environment in which they are regulating. So I'm going to turn to Jason, and I'd like to ask you, Jason, when these regulations inevitably change, and particularly some of the underlying guidance associated with them, who should be involved in the review processes, and what should be evaluated as part of that review process?
Yeah, absolutely, and as we all know, things are constantly changing. I mean, that is the only constant, right? And just as these regulations or these, even to your point, Colin, the guidelines supporting the regulations, we know that those structures are not inherently simplistic. And I would say neither is, really the answer to this question. But again, let's break this down into somewhat simplistic pieces, right? I think primarily or fundamentally, kind of having some capability to identify those changes as they happen, or even before they happen is obviously going to be critical. That concept of anticipation of the change. Because as we all know, depending on the nature of that change or the breadth of that change, the impacts to your specific organization or elements of your organization, they could be relatively benign, and it might just be, a simplistic change. But as we all know, for example, new privacy regulations rolling out over the last couple of years, they can be quite significant. So, having a system or a mechanism to identify those changes is definitely a great place to start. First, a place to catalog them, and then a way to identify and sort of stay on top of those changes. Depending on the nature of the changes, you're dealing with, you really probably need to consider retaining some level of expertise, whether that's internal or external, to help decipher the impact that those changes are going to have. I mean, it's, you call it a cost of doing business, but, not just because folks are in compliance doesn't necessarily mean that they've been given the proper tools or training to be able to interpret the impacts of a particular regulatory change. Now, that's not necessarily going to say that every single time a regulation changes, you need to retain outside counsel. But certainly just having that sort of expertise at your disposal, much like you would, any other legal expertise or tax expertise, seems to make a lot of sense. And then kind of back to what Todd was saying, sort of the integration of the responsibilities or the coordination of those lines within that 3 lines model. They're all going to be involved, and collaboration is definitely going to be key here. So, if you've established the structure that we've kind of already been talking about, where what your regulations are and what some of those downstream impacts are, the policies, the controls, and the risks, and more importantly, you've identified the ownership around those, you can actually, and certainly systematically, if that's a capability you've explored or are currently using, you can use the fact that a regulation has changed, for example, to sort of enable that downstream notification communication to those folks who are clearly going to be impacted, assigning that clear ownership in those specific areas, so who's responsible for evaluating the change. And then ultimately, it's again back to that human element concept that Chase was talking about. You're going to need to rely on the judgment and the expertise of the people, right? And if you've gone through the rigor and the practice of hiring the right types of people, that's not something that should really wear on you. You'll have people in place who can exercise the judgment. But again, I think it does point back to truly to that this is definitely an area where that coordination among the three lines is going to be fundamental and essential.
Thanks very much for that, Jason. I can't help stress the importance of getting an outside view on these things. I think many enterprises get themselves into stuck on the train tracks of their thought processes and can't think beyond what they've done in the past. I think having outside views is always important. So thank you for stressing that. I think it's very important. We've already heard here how important, as we kick up the maturity of our programs, to adopt some sort of robotic processes and automated tools to contribute to information gathering, alerts, and support, decision support tools, etc. So we thought this is an area where we would welcome how the audiences think their enterprises are proceeding on this automation journey. So we've got our final poll for you, which is now going live, and we're going to ask you a question about what percentage of your governance, risk, and compliance technology, both first and second line support, is integrated into your core GRC system and capabilities. And while that poll is going on, I'm going to turn to one of the proponents of our panelists, who's really fond about automation, and that's Chase. Chase, what are some of the disadvantages in using robotic processes and automation, and how do we consider a better value-cost approach to what we choose to use?
Yep, that's a great question, and I know obviously organizations are thinking about automating if they've done things manually to this point. So there's always, kind of that value cost understanding, right? And every organization has different budgetary constraints, et cetera. So this is obviously going to be a question that all organizations do consider when talking about robotic process automation. But I think when you start getting to the point where compliance is growing and it cannot be managed anymore manually, you really need to think about automation and getting away from Excel. The toughest thing for organizations is staying on top of all of these requirements as well as the requirements that they have been managing. And, as I've been discussing, that these requirements are not decreasing, they're increasing exponentially in many cases. And as well as organizations are expanding their operations and taking on new jurisdictions, this is only going to continue to increase. So from a scalability perspective, obviously I understand there's always going to be cost concerns for organizations, but really to take the program to the next level and grow with your business from a compliance perspective, I do think it's critical. So I don't see a ton of disadvantages of moving forward with robotic process automation, and it's come down in cost quite a bit, right? We're talking about modernizing your compliance program. Most compliance solutions out there have some form of robotic process automation already pre-built in out of the box. So I think it is much more attainable than it has been in the past. But it's about making things programmatic and repeatable. That's really the goal here, and to really do more with less, as I was mentioning. So that logic that you use here to really establish robotic process automation is something that should be chosen from a strategy level, from the human element, but it should be very reusable for the tasks and the collection of evidence. This is some. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, given that point, what do you think about the scores on the doors? I mean, the sort of level of percentage people are doing seems to be relatively quite high. So does that seem to support your case at all, that people are making the right decisions?
I think, again, this is a very changing trend right now. It's increasing as we go. So I think, it's not a surprise to see between 75 and 100% only at 3% of the audience polled. That is not surprising at all. But I think, over the next 10 years, you're going to see this curve change in the other direction, really. Integrations are much easier out of platforms now. Technology platforms for risk management, as well as those first and second line applications, are really being built from the ground up now to be able to connect to outside systems. We're moving to that SaaS world away from the on-premise world. Some organizations are still doing things on-premise and will continue to do that. But again, we're seeing a big trend of moving more towards those systems that can connect to other applications and share data as necessary, which is really creating great efficiencies. And this is very much related to Todd's discussion about scale data in your compliance program, as well as Kevin mentioning the duplication of efforts, right? We see duplication of efforts all the time in GRC and compliance programs, and really this is about getting around that. And audits, honestly, is where we see the biggest advantage of this, having everything available to you in one single place. Really helps take that audit from being a 3-month adventure to maybe a month, So I think there are great advantages that you will see from really leveraging robotic process automation. But again, I think we're going to continue to see this start to move in the other direction over the next 10 years.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Chase. Kevin, I'd like to turn to yourself now, because you're actually doing it for real within your own organization. So you're a practitioner as well as understanding the benefits. So to what extent has your own organization streamlined or automated your compliance efforts? And can you give us some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said earlier, I think while we are a software provider in this space, we are no different than anyone else, where we're constantly working with ideally not enough resources, and so we have to balance this ourselves. And so one of the things that I think has been talked at length about today that we've done is just really streamline the work and make sure it's going in the right direction efficiently, is establishing the right committees or working groups. And so that's one thing, but it's been talked about at length today. The other thing that we've done is, and this is probably no surprise given what we do, is establish a centralized system using our software that can capture the GRC data in the business processes and add value along the way. And Todd, I thought, had a great analogy for that. Just the task at hand is to get GRC and compliance work into the heartbeat of the business and try to establish home base. And that's what we've done. So, I think one of the key things there that's unique in GRC and risk management and compliance is the interconnectedness of all these different work streams. And so if you can have a system that can help to understand the interconnectedness, linking different pieces of the puzzle together, that can be incredibly helpful. So for us, an example is we started really with controls management, and NIST and SOC 2 were our initial two. But for example, how do you can you map those controls together so you're not duplicating the work and managing them separately? So we were able to do that. And that was a core foundation to our overall enterprise risk management program that we're continuing to build over time. And so we've continued to add pieces over time, like financial close management. So that's really just us getting ahead of SOX. We're not yet a public company, but we have that could potentially be in our future. So we're really just getting ahead of that and adding value to the finance team along the way. Third-party risk management was another piece of the puzzle that we added. I think someone said earlier, just as an example, when you can add value to procurement by helping them contextualize the risk of the vendors that they're bringing on within their workflows. So that led us down the path of adding vendor risk management. We ultimately have all the contracts in the system. So now we're doing analysis on our contract risk and trying to understand the different pieces of risk that come along with contracts and certainly the compliance obligations as well. So we've just been building incrementally over time, and the system that we use has allowed us to do that. So that's one way. Those are some of the ways that we've streamlined our work over time to help manage, again, limited resources, as is always the case.
Thanks very much for that, Kevin. And you give me the brilliant lead in to Todd, which is about third parties. So from your perspective, Todd, how do compliance programs need to consider the incorporation of third parties, not just how they're compliant for you, but there are third parties' own compliance activities?
Yeah, exactly, Colin. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? So the third party in its own right needs to be compliant with its own regulations, and you need to ensure that you understand what they're trying to do to understand behavior. But you also certainly have to understand what that third party is to your business in terms of your own compliance regulations. So certainly, what we've seen is an increase in third parties really being treated almost as first parties in the context of corporate compliance, where it's just another extension. If you look at some of our customers that do the cybersecurity program management, for example, the internal assessment of your compliance has to also have an equal force to it around the external compliance. So what are your third parties doing? And you have to combine those two things. So the umbrella is not just what's going on inside of our company, but certainly more and more and more of the fabric of these organizations is made up of third-party products and services so that you can compete to market and get to market faster and do things at a faster speed of business, right? So you have to consider how you're evaluating those third parties and the rate of those that come in incrementally. If you think about being compliant just within your own organization and then adding, 1,000 organizations to your own to manage compliance against can be a multiplier that's complex, right? And so what we've seen certainly from getting to modernization, right, is to actually leverage and understand that your compliance program is an internal program meant to drive proof of compliance, drive good behavior, drive standards and policies that make sense to your business, that are adhering to the things that your industry is telling you have to do, and providing evidence of that, but wanting to feed data into it from all these different places. So there's lots of aggregate content and automation and intelligence that we certainly provide for our customers to be able to take that external data into their internal decisioning so that they can complement the amount of work that they're trying to do, right? Somebody said that earlier, that you need to do more with less, and certainly one way to do that is from integrating and identifying and prioritizing your special data that's going to help you make decisions faster, whether that's monitoring your third-party population with aggregate data providers in terms of anti-bribery corruption, in terms of financial resiliency, in terms of pandemic resiliency now, and certainly in terms of information security. You want to be able to accelerate that with automated intelligence and bring that into your, again, your backbone of your compliance system that should be there for you to rely on in terms of a standard as everything else around it changes. Right.
Thanks very much, Steve, for that, Todd. That's excellent insights. And I know for all our panelists, we could be going all afternoon about this subject, because I know we're also very passionate about it, but we've come to the end. So I'm going to have to go around and ask for some takeaways from each of our panelists in turn. And I'm going to start with yourself, Chase. Can you give us your takeaway recommendations and any other closing remarks you have for today's listeners?
Yeah, my takeaway, well, obviously I was really focused on AI and robotic process automation. I think, again, that's a huge trend in this space and something that's going to continue to increase. So organizations should think to invest there. But, really enjoyed the panel today, and a lot of great conversation around that top-down approach versus the bottom-up approach. And certainly collaboration across committees is something that needs to be done. And having that executive buy-in from the top to create that baseline strategy, got to have executives involved in that piece of the puzzle to really, again, create that strategy and buy-in from all stakeholders is really critical. And I think that's a great takeaway here.
Thanks very much indeed, Chase. Over to yourself, Jason. What would be your takeaway and final remark?
Yeah, absolutely, Colin. So, to me, it's a lot of this, and being on a panel with a lot of great minds, and I really appreciate the panel being a part of this. But we're all from technology companies, or at least all of the panelists are, and certainly the value of technology can't be minimized here. It's certainly not the silver bullet answer. It's not the only answer. The real kind of the real insight comes from your organization, understanding what you're required to comply with, but where possible, making those critical data linkages, because I've always believed that, data can become information, which can become insight, which can ultimately become knowledge. So having that linkage leads to that understanding. And then just to kind of follow up on Chase's point, getting the right people involved, getting everybody involved and understanding what their role is really critical, because the more involved people are, the more invested people are in the process.
Jason, thank you for that. Todd, your final thoughts for this afternoon's conversation?
Sure. No, I think it was a really good conversation to have, and it is all about people, process, and technology, isn't it? So it's a continuous evolution of having that organized and managing change, and doing what you need to do to have that. Key takeaway, obviously, get organized, right? If you're not, you need to establish that centralized backbone and be able to have something you can rely on to build off of. That's always important. The test once, satisfy many mantra that's been out there for a long time it makes a lot of sense, and it keeps things from having that duplication that we talked about earlier. So really, really good conversation today with the panel here, and looking forward to having more conversations.
Thank you very much, Steve. Todd. Last but definitely not least, Kevin, what's your final takeaway for everyone today?
Hey, yeah, thanks everyone. Great discussion today. I'll go back to kind of the start for me is I think one of my takeaways is just it's all incumbent upon all of us to bring the right mindset to the table. Compliance is a strategic part of the business, and and it's increasingly so in today's world, just given many tailwinds in different ways. So I think it's important for all of us to bring that back to our organizations and communicate accordingly. If we do that, I think we'll find ourselves moving compliance programs further, faster, and as some of the panelists just said, thinking about the right technology can help you do so more efficiently. So I think just keep bringing that mindset and making sure you're educating your organizations accordingly.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. I thoroughly enjoyed this afternoon's conversation with you all. It's been an excellent conversation. So with regrets, I've got to pass it back to Kelly.
Okay, thanks, Colin. That was a great discussion. I'm sure our audience appreciates all of the information. And listeners, please check out the additional supporting resources related to the topic on executiveitforums.org. And for those who qualify for CPE credit, your certificate will be issued shortly via our new e-learning platform, so watch for the email notification on that. Our next CPE webinar is on September 24th, and it's a third-party risk management masterclass. You can reserve your seat now through the console, but before you do that, please do take a moment to leave us a rating and feedback for the session. We value your feedback, and it helps us when we're planning future events. So that's it for today. I'd like to thank our speakers for your participation, with a special thanks to our sponsors, LogicGate, OnSpring, Process Unity, and OneTrust GRC, without whom this event would not be possible. And of course, thanks again for listening. Please stay tuned for our next event, and have a great day, everyone.